The knock came just after sundown, when the light had gone soft and orange through the cottonwoods and the air smelled of dust settling after a long day's heat. Samuel Hutchins had been at his table, alone, eating beans from a tin plate with bread he'd baked 2 days prior. The knock was soft, hesitant, almost apologetic, and for a moment he thought he'd imagined it. Then it came again. He set his fork down slowly, listening. The wind had died. The horses in the corral were quiet. He could hear the faint creak of the porch boards under someone's weight. Samuel rose, wiping his hands on his trousers, and crossed the small cabin in 4 strides. He lifted the latch and pulled the door open just wide enough to see who stood there. A man, young, maybe 25, with a thin face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Behind him, barely visible in the fading light, was a woman. She held a bundle against her chest, wrapped in cloth, small and still. The man's eyes met Samuel's. They were tired, desperate in a quiet way. "Evening, sir," the man said. His voice was careful, like he'd rehearsed the words. "We don't mean to trouble you. We've been riding since yesterday morning. We saw your light from the ridge." Samuel didn't answer right away. He studied them both. The woman's dress was torn at the hem, dusty and stained. Her face was pale, her eyes cast down. The bundle in her arms didn't move. "We're not asking for much," the man continued. "Just wondered if we could sleep in your barn tonight. We'll be gone before first light. You won't even know we were here." Samuel's gaze drifted past them, out toward the barn. It was a solid structure, wood and iron, built when he'd first claimed this land 15 years ago. He'd spent nights in it himself, when the cabin was nothing but a foundation and a dream. He looked back at the couple. The woman hadn't lifted her eyes once. "Barn's full of hay and tools," Samuel said quietly. "It's cold at night. Wind comes through the boards." The man nodded quickly. "That's fine, sir. We're grateful for anything." Samuel's jaw tightened. He glanced again at the woman, at the bundle she held so carefully. His throat felt dry. "You got a name?" Samuel asked. "Thomas," the man said. "Thomas Farrow. This is my wife, Grace." Grace finally looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face drawn with exhaustion that went deeper than miles traveled. She said nothing, but her gaze held Samuel's for just a moment, long enough for him to see something break inside her. Samuel stepped back from the door. "You're not sleeping in the barn," he said. Thomas blinked. "Sir, we don't want to impose." "You'll take the bed," Samuel said, his voice firm but not unkind. "I'll sleep out by the fire." Thomas stared at him, stunned. "We can't." "You can," Samuel interrupted. He opened the door wider and gestured inside. "Come on, it's getting dark." Thomas exchanged a glance with his wife, uncertain. Grace's lips trembled, but she nodded slightly. Thomas swallowed hard and took off his hat. "Thank you," he whispered. Samuel stepped aside and let them enter. The cabin was small, one room with a bed in the corner, a table, a stone hearth, and a few shelves lined with books and tools. It wasn't much, but it was clean and it was warm. Grace moved slowly toward the bed, still cradling the bundle. Samuel watched her sit carefully on the edge of the mattress, her hands adjusting the cloth with a tenderness that made his chest tighten. Thomas stood near the door, awkward and uncertain, his hat in his hands. "We'll leave at dawn, sir, I promise." Samuel turned toward the hearth and added a log to the fire. Sparks rose and danced in the chimney's draft. "You eaten?" he asked. Thomas hesitated. "We had some jerky this morning." Samuel grunted and moved to the table. He scooped beans onto a second plate, tore off a piece of bread, and set it down. "Eat." "Sir, you don't have to." "Sit down and eat," Samuel said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Thomas obeyed, sitting slowly at the table. He ate in silence, his movements careful, like a man who hadn't tasted kindness in a long time. Samuel poured water into 2 tin cups and set them on the table. He glanced toward Grace, who sat motionless on the bed, staring down at the bundle in her arms. "She all right?" Samuel asked quietly. Thomas looked over his shoulder, his face tightening. She hasn't spoken much today. Samuel waited. Thomas set his fork down, his voice low. We lost our son 3 days ago. The words hung in the air like smoke. Samuel's hands stilled. He didn't look at Thomas. He stared into the fire instead, watching the flames twist and curl. Fever took him, Thomas continued, his voice breaking slightly. We were traveling to Fort Collins, thought we could find a doctor there, but we didn't make it in time. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, his jaw clenched. We buried him under a cottonwood by the river, Thomas said. Grace, she hasn't been the same since. Samu. El finally turned and looked at the young man. Thomas's eyes were wet, his face pale and hollow. I'm sorry, Samuel said, and he meant it. Thomas nodded, wiping his face quickly. We just need 1 night, then we'll be out of your hair. Samuel didn't respond. He looked again at Grace, who sat unmoving, her lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps just a whisper to the child who was no longer there. He turned back to the fire and sat down on the floor beside it, his back against the stone hearth. He pulled a blanket over his shoulders and stared into the flames. Behind him, Thomas finished eating in silence. Eventually, he rose and moved to the bed, sitting beside his wife. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, and she leaned into him, still holding the empty bundle. The cabin grew quiet. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind began to rise, rustling through the cottonwoods and brushing against the cabin walls. Samuel closed his eyes, but he didn't sleep. He listened to the sound of Grace's quiet weeping, muffled against her husband's chest. And he wondered why he'd opened the door at all. Samuel woke before dawn, as he always did. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing faintly in the dim light. He rose quietly, careful not to wake the couple in the bed, and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The sky was still dark, stars fading into the pale blue that came just before sunrise. The land was silent, except for the distant call of a crow. He walked to the well, drew water, and splashed his face. The cold shocked him awake. He stood there for a moment, hands dripping, staring out at the ridgeline where the first light was beginning to gather. He thought about the couple inside, about the bundle Grace held, about the grave under a cottonwood tree. He thought about his own losses. When he returned to the cabin, Thomas was awake, sitting at the table with his head in his hands. Grace was still asleep, curled on her side, the cloth bundle tucked beneath her chin. Thomas looked up when Samuel entered. His eyes were red. I didn't mean to stay so long, Thomas said quietly. I'll wake her, we'll go. Samuel shook his head. Let her sleep. Thomas hesitated. You've already done more than. Let her sleep, Samuel repeated, his tone gentle but firm. Thomas nodded slowly and looked down at his hands. Samuel moved to the hearth and began building the fire back up. He set a pot of coffee on to boil and sliced bread from the loaf on the shelf. He worked in silence, methodical and unhurried. After a while, Thomas spoke. Why'd you do it? Samuel didn't look up. Do what? Give us your bed, let us stay, you don't know us. Samuel poured coffee into 2 cups and set one in front of Thomas. He sat down across from him, cradling his own cup in both hands. Doesn't matter if I know you, Samuel said quietly. Thomas studied him for a long moment. Most folks wouldn't have even opened the door. Samuel took a sip of coffee. It was bitter and hot. Most folks got their reasons. And you do. Samuel's gaze drifted toward the bed, where Grace lay motionless. I got mine. Thomas waited, sensing there was more. Samuel set his cup down and leaned back in his chair. I had a wife once, and a daughter. Thomas's expression softened. Fever took them both, Samuel continued, his voice low and steady. Winter of '71, I was out checking traps when it hit. By the time I got back, they were gone. The silence that followed was heavy. I'm sorry, Thomas whispered. Samuel nodded. It's been a long time, but I remember what it feels like. He looked directly at Thomas. to carry something you can't let go of. Thomas's eyes welled up. He looked away, swallowing hard. You don't owe us anything, Thomas said, his voice breaking, but I won't forget this. Samuel stood and moved to the window, looking out at the land bathed in early morning light. You got somewhere to go. Thomas shook his head. We were heading to Fort Collins, but I don't know anymore. We got no family, no money. I figured I'd find work somewhere. Samuel was quiet for a long moment. There's a town about 2 days north of here, he said finally. Small place. They're building a church. I know the preacher. He's a good man. He might be able to help you. Thomas looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. You think so? I'll write you a letter, Samuel said. You give it to him, tell him I sent you. Thomas stood quickly, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Samuel replied. Just take care of your wife. Behind them, Grace stirred. She sat up slowly, blinking in the dim light, still holding the bundle. Her gaze moved from Thomas to Samuel, confused and wary. It's all right, Thomas said gently, moving to her side. We're safe. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She looked down at the cloth in her arms, and her shoulders began to shake. Thomas wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly as she wept. Samuel turned away, giving them privacy. He moved to the door and stepped outside, closing it softly behind him. He walked to the corral and leaned against the fence, watching the horses graze in the pale morning light. The air was cool and clean, and for a moment he let himself feel the weight of it all, the grief, the kindness, the strange mercy of still being alive. Inside the cabin, he could hear Grace's muffled sobs and Thomas's low, soothing voice. Samuel closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He didn't know why he'd opened the door last night. Maybe it was loneliness, maybe it was guilt, maybe it was just the memory of a woman and a little girl who'd once filled this cabin with laughter. But whatever the reason, he'd made his choice. And he would see it through. An hour later, Thomas emerged from the cabin, his face calm but heavy. He approached Samuel slowly, hands in his pockets. She's resting, Thomas said. I think she'll be all right, eventually. Samuel nodded. I want to thank you again, Thomas said, for everything. Samuel straightened and looked at him. You remember what I said, head north, find the preacher, his name's Elijah Moss, give him my letter. I will, Thomas promised. Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Thomas. Take this, and take some supplies from the barn before you go. Food, water, blankets. Thomas stared at the letter, his eyes glistening. Why are you doing this? Samuel's jaw tightened. He looked out at the horizon, at the vast, empty land that stretched on forever. Because somebody did it for me once, he said quietly, long time ago. Thomas nodded, clutching the letter tightly. They stood there in silence, two men bound by loss and the strange, fragile hope of mercy. And somewhere in the distance, a rider appeared on the ridge. The rider came slowly, a dark silhouette against the brightening sky. Samuel saw him first, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the figure's approach. The man rode with purpose, no hesitation, no wandering, straight toward the cabin. Thomas noticed Samuel's posture shift. What is it? Go inside, Samuel said quietly. What? Go inside, now. Thomas obeyed, moving quickly back into the cabin. Samuel remained at the fence, arms crossed, watching the rider descend the ridge. It took another 10 minutes before the man reached the edge of Samuel's property. He was broad-shouldered, weathered, with a thick beard and cold eyes. A rifle rested across his saddle. A tin star glinted on his chest. Sheriff's deputy. Samuel didn't move. The rider reined his horse to a stop a few feet away, leaning forward in the saddle. His gaze swept over the cabin, the barn, the corral, before settling on Samuel. Morning, the deputy said. His voice was rough, like gravel scraped over wood. Morning, Samuel replied evenly. The deputy tilted his head slightly, studying him. You Samuel Hutchins. I am. The deputy nodded slowly. Name S. Caleb Warren. I'm riding out of Leadville, looking for a couple, man and a woman, young, traveling on foot or horseback. He paused. You seen anyone like that? Samuel's expression didn't change. Why are you looking for them? Warren's eyes darkened. That's law business. You're on my land, Samuel said calmly. Makes it my business too. Warren's jaw tightened. He shifted in the saddle, his hand resting near the rifle. They stole a horse 2 days back from a ranch outside of town. Owner wants it back, and he wants them brought in. Samuel's gaze didn't waver. Stole a horse. That's right. And you're sure it was them? Warren smirked. Rancher saw them. Young man, young woman, took off in the night with one of his best mares. He leaned forward. Now I'll ask you again, you seen them? Samuel was silent for a long moment. He could feel the weight of the lie he was about to tell, the line he was about to cross. Behind him, inside the cabin, he knew Thomas was listening, waiting. No, Samuel said finally, haven't seen anyone. Warren stared at him, unblinking. You sure about that? I'm sure. The deputy's gaze drifted past Samuel toward the cabin. You live alone out here? I do. Mind if I take a look inside? Samuel's voice turned cold. I do mind. Warren's hand moved closer to the rifle. You got something to hide. I got a right to privacy, Samuel said, same as any man. The two men stared at each other, tension coiling in the air between them like a rattlesnake ready to strike. Finally, Warren sat back in his saddle, his eyes narrowing. You're making a mistake, Hutchins. Maybe, Samuel said, but it's mine to make. Warren's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. You know what happens to folks who harbor thieves. Samuel didn't answer. Warren nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. I'll be back, he said, and when I come back, I'm bringing the sheriff. You understand me? I understand. Warren spurred his horse and turned, riding back the way. He'd come. Samuel watched him go, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands steady but cold. When the rider disappeared over the ridge, Samuel finally exhaled. He turned and walked back to the cabin. Thomas was standing just inside the door, his face pale. He knows, Thomas whispered. Samuel closed the door behind him and moved to the window, watching the ridgeline. Maybe. He said we stole a horse. Did you? Thomas's face twisted with shame. We were desperate. We had no money, no food. Grace was, he broke off, his voice cracking. I was going to bring it back, I swear. Samuel turned to face him. Doesn't matter now. He's coming back, Thomas said, panic rising in his voice. He's going to bring the sheriff. They'll arrest us, maybe worse. Samuel's jaw tightened. Then you need to leave. Grace appeared in the doorway to the bedroom, her eyes wide and frightened. What's happening? Thomas moved to her side, taking her hand. We have to go. No, Grace whispered. Please, Thomas, I can't. We don't have a choice. Samuel stepped forward. Listen to me. You take the trail north like I told you. Stay off the main roads. Move fast, but don't run. Running makes you look guilty. Thomas nodded, his face set with grim determination. What about you? I'll be fine. He'll come back for you. Samuel's eyes were hard. Let him. Thomas stared at him, torn between gratitude and guilt. Why are you doing this? You don't even know us. Samuel's voice softened slightly. I know enough. Grace stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. She reached out and took Samuel's hand, squeezing it tightly. Thank you, she whispered. Samuel nodded once, then pulled his hand away gently. Go, now. Thomas grabbed their few belongings and led Grace outside. Samuel followed them to the barn, where he saddled one of his own horses, a sturdy mare, calm and reliable. Take her, Samuel said. She'll get you where you need to go. Thomas's eyes widened. I can't. You can, Samuel said firmly, and you will. Thomas mounted the horse and pulled Grace up behind him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her face pressed against his back. Samuel handed Thomas the letter and a small pouch of dried meat and bread. "Don't stop until you reach the town. Find Elijah Moss. He'll help you." Thomas looked down at Samuel, his throat tight. "I won't forget this." Samuel stepped back. "Just live, that's enough." Thomas nodded, then spurred the horse forward. Grace looked back once, her tear-streaked face pale in the morning light, and then they were gone, disappearing into the trees, heading north. Samuel stood alone in the yard, watching them go. The wind picked up, stirring the dust at his feet. And somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint sound of hoofbeats returning. Samuel didn't wait for them to arrive. He walked back into the cabin, poured himself another cup of coffee, and sat down at the table. His hands were steady, his mind was clear. He knew what was coming. It didn't take long. The hoofbeats grew louder, and soon there were voices outside, low, clipped, authoritative. Samuel didn't move. He sipped his coffee and waited. The door opened without a knock. Deputy Warren stepped inside first, followed by an older man wearing a sheriff's badge. The sheriff was tall and lean, with silver hair and a weathered face that had seen too many years of hard justice. "Samuel Hutchins?" the sheriff asked. "That's right." The sheriff glanced around the cabin, at the single bed, the cold hearth, the table with one cup. "I'm Sheriff Tom Brennan. I believe you've already met my deputy." Samuel nodded. "I have." Brennan's gaze was sharp, assessing. "Deputy Warren says you denied seeing a young couple pass through here. That true?" Samuel met his eyes. "It is." Brennan studied him for a long moment. "You know, lying to a lawman is a serious offense." "I'm aware." Warren stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "He's hiding something, Sheriff. I can feel it." Brennan raised a hand, silencing him. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from Samuel, his movements deliberate and calm. "Let me tell you what I know," Brennan said quietly. "2 nights ago, a young man and his wife took a horse from a ranch outside Leadville. The rancher wants his property back. He also wants justice." He leaned forward slightly. "Now, I don't know if they're thieves or just desperate folks who made a bad choice, but either way, they broke the law." Samuel said nothing. Brennan continued. "What I also know is that you're a good man, Samuel. I've heard your name before. You served in the war. You built this place with your own hands. You keep to yourself, don't cause trouble." He paused. "So I'm asking you, as one man to another, did they come here?" Samuel's jaw tightened. He looked down at his coffee, then back up at the sheriff. "They did," he said quietly. Warren's face lit up with triumph. "I knew it." Brennan ignored him, his eyes locked on Samuel. "Where are they now?" "Gone." "Where?" Samuel shook his head. "I don't know." Brennan's expression hardened. "Don't do this, Samuel." "They lost a child," Samuel said, his voice low and steady. 3 days ago, fever. They buried him under a cottonwood by the river." The room fell silent. Brennan's face shifted, something flickering in his eyes. Sympathy, maybe, or recognition. "That doesn't change what they did," Brennan said softly. "No," Samuel agreed, "but it changes why they did it." Warren scoffed. "So what? They're still thieves." Samuel turned his gaze to the deputy, his voice cold. "You ever lost someone you loved?" Warren blinked, caught off guard. "I have," Samuel continued, "and I can tell you, desperation makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. It doesn't make it right, but it makes it human." Brennan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You gave them shelter." "I did." "And you let them go." "I did." "Why?" Samuel's voice was quiet but firm. "Because somebody had to." Brennan stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stood. "You're obstructing justice, Samuel," Brennan said. "I could arrest you right now." Samuel didn't flinch. "Then do it." The 2 men stared at each other, the weight of the moment pressing down like stone. Finally, Brennan turned to Warren. "We're done here." Warren's face twisted with disbelief. What, Sheriff, he admitted. We are done, Brennan repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Warren glared at Samuel, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. He turned and walked out of the cabin, slamming the door behind him. Brennan lingered for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. You're a hard man to figure, Samuel. I'm not trying to be anything, Samuel replied. Brennan nodded slowly. If those two get caught, I'll have to bring them in. You understand that? I do. And if they do, Brennan trailed off, then shook his head. Well, I suppose that's between them and God. He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back. For what it's worth, I hope they make it. Samuel said nothing. Brennan left, closing the door quietly behind him. Samuel sat alone at the table, listening to the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. Outside, the sun climbed higher into the sky, casting long shadows across the empty yard. 3 weeks passed before Samuel heard anything. He returned to his routine, tending the horses, mending fences, working the land. The cabin was quiet again, as it had always been, but something had shifted. The silence felt different now, less empty, more like waiting. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. Samuel found it tucked into his door. No postmark, no envelope, just a folded piece of paper held in place by a small stone. He opened it slowly. Mr. Hutchins. We made it to the town. Elijah Moss took us in just like you said. He's a good man. He gave us work and a place to stay. Grace is doing better. She smiles sometimes now. It's small, but it's something. I returned the horse, rode back to Leadville and left it at the ranch with a note. I don't know if it'll make things right, but it was the least I could do. I don't have words big enough to thank you for what you did. You saved us, not just our lives, our souls too. You reminded us that there's still good in this world, even when it feels like there is. Grace wanted me to tell you something. She said, tell him we're naming our next child after him. I don't know if that'll happen, but if it does, I'll make sure they know who you are. We won't forget you, Mr. Hutchins, ever. Thomas and Grace Farrow. Samuel read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. He walked outside and stood in the yard, looking out at the land that stretched endlessly before him. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, rustling the leaves with a sound like whispers. He thought about Thomas and Grace, about the child they'd lost and the life they were trying to rebuild. He thought about his own wife and daughter, their faces fading now with time, but never truly gone. And he thought about the choice he'd made, to open the door, to give them his bed, to let them go. It hadn't been easy, it hadn't even been smart. But it had been right. A few days later, Sheriff Brennan rode out to the cabin again. This time, he came alone. Samuel was chopping wood when he arrived. He set the axe down and waited. Brennan dismounted slowly, his expression unreadable. He walked over to Samuel and stopped a few feet away. Thought you should know, Brennan said. The horse was returned. Rancher got it back 3 days ago, found it tied to his fence post with a note. Samuel nodded. That's so. Note said the man who took it was sorry, said he'd been desperate and made a mistake. Brennan paused. Rancher's still angry, but he's not pressing charges. Says he got his property back, and that's enough. Samuel picked up the axe again, testing its weight. Good. Brennan studied him for a long moment. You knew they'd return it. I hoped they would. Brennan smiled faintly. You're a strange man, Samuel Hutchins. So I've been told. The sheriff mounted his horse and tipped his hat. Take care of yourself. You too, Sheriff. Brennan rode away, and Samuel went back to chopping wood. Years later, when Samuel was an old man with silver hair and hands that trembled slightly in the cold, he would sit on his porch in the evenings and watch the sun set over the land he'd worked all his life. Sometimes, when the wind was right, he'd hear the faint sound of laughter carried from somewhere far away, children playing, a woman singing, the low murmur of a life being lived. He never saw Thomas and Grace again, but he heard stories. A preacher in a small town up north spoke of a young couple who'd arrived broken and left whole. A traveling merchant mentioned a family with a boy named Samuel, strong and kind, who helped his father build houses and his mother tend the garden. Samuel never knew for certain if those stories were about them, but he liked to think they were. On his last night, when the fever finally took him and the world grew soft and dim, he dreamed of his wife and daughter waiting for him in a field of golden light. They were smiling, and beside them stood a young couple, Thomas and Grace, holding a child between them. "Thank you," Grace said, her voice like music. Samuel nodded, too tired to speak. And then he walked toward them, into the light, into the peace he'd been carrying all along. The cabin stood empty after that, silent and still beneath the endless sky. But if you stood there on a quiet evening, when the wind moved through the cottonwoods and the stars began to appear, you might hear it. The faint echo of a door opening. The soft sound of footsteps crossing a threshold. The whisper of mercy offered and received. And you would know, without question, that something good had happened here. Something worth remembering.